Welcome everyone, this is DerekJ Speaks, and today we are talking about the latest edition of AEW Dynamite, live from Charleston, West Virginia on August 17th, 2022, a show that was built up around the theme of the latest HBO Max original, House of the Dragon, of course, a Game of Thrones spinoff. But even bigger than that was the hype around the main event on this show. One of the first matches in the tournament to crown the first ever AEW Trios champions. It was the team of Andrade El Idolo, Rush, and Dragon Lee against the Young Bucks and, of course, a mystery partner. The Young Bucks reconciled with Adam Page last week, but Hangman turned them down to be their partner in this tournament. And so all week we had speculation regarding who would be the mystery partner for the Young Bucks. Although it didn't take much for people to figure out who that man would be, and to the shock of no one, but to the delight of many people, including the people in the crowd on this show in West Virginia, the mystery partner turned out to be the returning Kenny Omega. The first time Kenny Omega has been in an AEW ring since the pay-per-view last November, Full Gear, where Kenny Omega dropped the AEW World Championship to Hangman Adam Page in the conclusion of a very long built-up storyline between the two of them. Omega finally lost his championship to Hangman, and he went on to vanish and took care of a bunch of nagging injuries that were building up within him. I think he had a torn labrum. That was one of many injuries. Don Callis, he was on the show tonight. He mentioned on commentary an injury to Omega's left knee. Several injuries that this man has had to deal with for the past several months. For a while there was even some doubt as to whether Omega would ever come back. But as we drew closer to All Out, the rumors began to run rampant, and it became very obvious once they introduced these trios titles that have been long rumored for years now in AEW. And even Tony Khan has mentioned in interviews that the championships were made and he was just waiting for the right time to introduce them. And of course, you had to know the time to introduce them would not be ready until Kenny Omega was ready to come back. And we got that on this show. Omega came out, huge ovation, reunited with the Young Bucks. The Elite were in the main event in a really fun main event against Dragon Lee, Rush, and Andrade. Also on this show, hyped up within the last few days, was the first, promo from the returning AEW World Champion, CM Punk. Of course, Punk's been out injured with a broken foot for the last several months, and he made his big return at the end of Dynamite last week. He was promoted to speak on this show, and boy did he. He dropped a few more pipe bombs on this show, and Jon Moxley, the current interim AEW World Champion, was sure to join him, and they had a very heated exchanging of words in the opening segment of Dynamite tonight, with a shocking direction announced later on around the match that we'll get between the two of them. You know, we had the promo, they came back a little bit later, had another brawl, and I'm thinking this is all great. This is how you build up and hype up a main event for a pay-per-view. This is how you sell tickets. This is how you sell buys to a pay-per-view. What Mox and Punk are doing tonight, great stuff. And then right before the main event, when they're running down the card for Rampage this Friday and Dynamite next week, they slotted in there right at the end that they're not going to wait until All Out, and we're getting CM Punk and Jon Moxley in a World Championship unification match next week on Dynamite, live from Cleveland, Ohio. So we're getting the World Championship unification match on free television next week instead of waiting for the All Out pay-per-view, which is just a few weeks after that. And of course, I haven't seen a whole lot of this because they announced this right as the main event was going on, so a lot of people were talking about the Kenny Omega stuff, but I got a glimpse of a lot of people's ideas on this, and suffice to say, it's not the most positive outlooks I've seen so far, but I have my own thoughts on where this might go, and it's a very interesting decision. I did not think that they would do this, but we'll get into that in a little bit later on. And another big thing promoted for this show was the big rematch between Bryan Danielson and Daniel Garcia, this time in a 2 out of 3 falls match. This match coming a few weeks after Garcia and Danielson had a great main event on Dynamite that ended with Garcia forcing Danielson to pass out to a submission hold, gave Garcia the biggest win of his life. And we got the rematch here, just as good as that original match, if not even better. Just a wonderfully worked wrestling match with an even better, more interesting story being told after the match between Daniel Garcia and Chris Jericho, which puts into question what Daniel Garcia's future is as a member of the Jericho Appreciation Society. So all that stuff and a few other things that didn't really matter on this show, but I'll try to go through as much of this as I can, not exactly in any real particular order. If you want a complete play-by-play run-through of this entire show, I implore you to seek out other content creators. I'm sure they have a great rundown of that, but that's not my style here. That's not what I want to do. I just want to have free-flowing thoughts based on some of the notes that I wrote down during the show and go through some of the big moments that happened and the bigger moments that stood out to me as we move onward towards the next big AEW pay-per-view called All Out. So as I mentioned, the show opened with CM Punk. Came out, got a huge ovation. Thought it was funny as he was making his entrance. He teased doing a crowd dive, but of course it was doing a crowd dive back in June that originally injured CM Punk in the first place. So he just had a little tease of that. So he got in the ring and he said that he had a few things to talk about, some important things and some unimportant things, and he wanted to get the unimportant stuff out of the way. And right out of nowhere, seemingly randomly, Punk calls out Hangman Adam Page. Of course, Hangman was the one who Punk beat to win the World Championship back at Double or Nothing earlier this year in May. So Punk calls out Hangman to come out and face Punk right now in a rematch for the championship. The crowd is going crazy. They're cheering for it, but no Hangman. He doesn't show up. He doesn't appear. The crowd boos. Punk says, "That's what I thought," basically, and says, now that the unimportant stuff's out of the way, implying that this whole situation with Hangman was completely unimportant to him. He then said that that's not cowboy shit, that's cowardly shit. And he said a piece of advice to Hangman: the apology must be as loud and as public as the disrespect. So Punk delivering a receipt to Hangman and many of the comments that Hangman said about Punk in the lead up to their match at Double or Nothing. Punk then reshifted his focus over to Jon Moxley, the interim world champion. He called him out. I won't go through every single thing he said because, quite frankly, I did not list every single thing that he or Moxley said for that matter. But he said something along the lines of Moxley always being the number 2 guy in the company. Whatever company he's in, Moxley's always just a step below the guy, which in this case would be CM Punk. Punk said that Mox is the 3rd best member of his own group, and that is a reoccurring theme throughout his career. Of course, mentioning and a little dig at the Shield, and of course Moxley being in the member of the Shield with Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins, and many people are of the belief that Dean Ambrose, was the weakest member of the Shield, but that's a debate for an entirely different day. But I thought this was a very fun remark from CM Punk. Of course, it popped the crowd. Punk mentioned a few other things about Moxley. He talked about Moxley's best friend, of course, that being Eddie Kingston, who has no love lost for CM Punk. If you recall their feud last year at Full Gear, Punk said that Eddie Kingston is the 3rd best Eddie he's ever wrestled and is the 2nd best Kingston he ever shared a locker room with. So again, even with the crowds love Eddie Kingston, but even this got a huge ovation from the crowd here because they were just into Punk's intensity, these shots he was firing all over the place, just delivering straight heat in this promo. Then Punk went on to say that Mox will not be the first John that he'll beat for a world championship in Chicago at All Out. And then this finally brought Jon Moxley out to the ring. Of course, he made his way through the crowd, and Punk, while waiting for Moxley to come out, he decided to make snow angels in the ring, something we've seen him do in the past. So we got the rude, crabby, dickish CM Punk on this show, and the crowd was loving it, and quite frankly, so was I. I was really into all this stuff from CM Punk. This is a version of CM Punk that we have not seen very often in AEW, and I was very happy to see it on display here because he played it so well. And this is a level of intensity and fire in the main event scene that we have not really gotten on AEW television in recent months. So it was great to see it here. Mox finally gets in the ring. He grabs the microphone. He tells Punk that he's been living in a fantasy world. He said Punk's not the best wrestler in the world. He's not even the best wrestler in catering. Mox said that Punk is delusional for thinking that that microphone gives him power, because it does not. Because in the real world, it's just a microphone. And that microphone and the words that he speaks into it don't mean shit. Mox also said that that belt Punk is holding, of course, Punk came out with his AEW World Championship belt. He said that belt don't mean shit either. But then he said, to be fair, neither does mine. My belt, Mox's championship belt, that don't mean shit either until he beats Punk. And in between here, Punk was making these other offhand remarks and comments in between while Moxley was talking. I like that. It made it seem more real. Typically in these promos, they go back and forth. One guy just says all this stuff, insulting this person, saying everything under the sun about him, and the other guy just stands there and takes it. Whereas here, you have Moxley throwing all these insults towards Punk, but Punk, he's throwing them back at him. He was already insulting him before Mox came out, but now he's in the ring and he's making these comments, going back and forth with Moxley. It made it feel more real. It made it feel more heated, which is preferred. So Mox says that every time he has been called the interim world champion, it makes him sick, because it makes him think about CM Punk, and that makes him feel sick. Punk says good. Moxley also mentioned the fact that he himself, that being Moxley, is the heart and soul of AEW. Punk said, good, you can be fine being the heart and soul. I'll, meanwhile, continue being the dollars and cents. There was a bit of a pause here. The crowd was reacting to it. Moxley wasn't saying anything. Punk's like, are you going to say anything else? And then Mox gets back on the mic and he responds by saying, we all know the only reason you're here is because you ran out of money. And so that doesn't mean anything to me. And so the fans are just going crazy for all of this. Just the heated barbs back and forth between these two. Just, you knew you were in the middle of something here. It reminded, this is not the first time we've seen CM Punk in a segment like this. We've seen him have this kind of similar back and forth with Hangman earlier this year. We saw it with him and MJF. We saw it with him and Eddie Kingston. So this is not something brand new with CM Punk on this show. And of course, Moxley, he's one of the best stick men in the game right now. He is excellent on the microphone. And one thing you could guarantee, if you get Jon Moxley and CM Punk face-to-face in the ring, you are guaranteed to have excellent verbal evisceration from both men. And that's exactly what we got on this show in this segment here. Mox said that being the best in the world is all about having heart and soul and about having a fighting spirit. And he told Punk that we both know you ran out of your fighting spirit a long time ago. But he challenged him. He challenged Punk by saying, you can prove me wrong right here and do something about it. But then Mox said that he knows Punk ain't gonna do shit. So Mox, he drops the mic. Punk gets the last big line in here. And he said he would, but he's scared that Mox is just gonna bleed all over him. Of course, a dig at Mox and his proneness to bleeding in all of his matches here. So now Punk drops the mic. The two of them go face to face and they're getting in each other's faces. Punk shoves Moxley. Moxley comes back around, kisses Punk right in the face. I think he kissed him in the mouth. Just a complete disrespectful move. And then he slaps him in the face and the two start throwing blows at each other, just start raining punches towards both of each other. Not the most realistic looking punches, but it looked like two men who were just throwing haymakers at each other. None of them really landing, but you just know one of these shots is going to land if I throw enough of them. So a big brawl here. A bunch of officials came out and broke the two of them up. They were still trying to get at each other, but eventually they were separated and they had to move on with the rest of the show. A little bit later on in the night, we are about to get a match with Tony Nese. Oh joy. Tony Nese is making his entrance. He's being accompanied by Smart Mark Sterling when he gets attacked from behind by Jon Moxley. Tony Nese gets laid out, as does Mark Sterling. Moxley gets in the ring and he says that I'm not waiting until All Out. I want to do this unification right here tonight with Punk. He calls out Punk to come back out, and out comes Punk. Of course, he is followed by some of the same officials that separated them earlier. And despite that, he gets in the ring. The two of them go at it again. The officials are there to separate them, to break them up. Claudio was out there. Of course, the latest member of the Blackpool Combat Club. He is out there. He's in Mox's corner. He's trying to hold him back and separate him. So the two men finally get separated, and that is the last we see of them for the night. And as I mentioned at the top of the video, I thought this was great. This was a great way to hype up the main event for All Out, the big championship unification match. They never made it official for All Out. CM Punk was speaking like this match was already made, a done deal, finished, that we just straight ahead into All Out for Chicago for the pay-per-view. But the match was never made official, although all signs clearly pointed to this match being made official for the pay-per-view. But then we soon found out later on, towards the end of the show, that this match will not be taking place at All Out. And Tony Khan has deemed it so that these two men are just incapable of waiting until All Out. So, we're going to do the championship match early. We're going to do the championship match in 1 week, live in Cleveland, free on free television on Dynamite next week. And as I mentioned, I haven't seen full through what other people are saying about this match being taken off the All Out card and being put on free television several weeks in advance. I have to believe that after the promos we got on this show and how these two are just ready to go at it, yeah, they're going to hype up a big main event for next week, but I don't think we're going to actually get that main event next week. This is something that AEW does not really do all that often. Typically, when they announce a big match, even if it's for TV, they deliver. They deliver a match. It has a great length to it, and typically, you get a decisive winner. There might be some shenanigans and chicanery in there mixed in, but for the most part, you get a decisive finish. You don't get very many countouts or DQs or no contests or draws or anything like that. You'll have the occasional one. Of course, we got it in the Omega Bryan match at Grand Slam last year. We got it in the match with Danielson and Hangman last year at Winter is Coming. So we've seen that before. But I think we might be setting up for something like that next week as well. I don't believe we are just getting this big championship main event for free, full on, with a clear-cut winner next week. I'll say it this way. This is supposed to be a championship unification match for next week. I do not believe we are going to get one unified champion at the end of the show next week. I could be wrong. And if I am, and they are just going to blow this match off on TV, even if they do a rematch at the pay-per-view or they set up something else, that's kind of a waste. Now, I know right now ratings is a big deal for AEW. Their ratings have been quite stagnant these last few months. They've remained pretty high, and they're still one of the highest rated shows on cable on Wednesday nights, but their numbers now compared to a year ago are not quite as strong. So I can see Tony Khan pulling a move like this to try to boost ratings for this show and hype up a big championship match on TV. But a match like this needs to be saved for a pay-per-view, which is why I am of the belief that Tony Khan, as smart of a promoter and a booker as he is smart enough to know that you cannot just give this match away in full for free on television. Unless he has some way bigger marquee match planned for All Out. And even then, it's like it would only get a few weeks build. This match, it would have only gotten a few weeks build. But unless he's setting up something even bigger that I can't even think of, I think next week we're going to get Punk, we're going to get Moxley, they're going to go at it, but there's going to be some kind of indecisive finish, whether it's a no contest, whether it's a draw, whatever it is, a double disqualification. Both men are just ready to tear each other apart. And that could lead to this match taking place at All Out, possibly with some type of stipulation attached to it. Whether it's like a Falls Count Anywhere match or even a steel cage match. Some type of stipulation that, one, makes sense for Jon Moxley to bleed. So that's one thing. But two, to really blow off this newfound personal heated rivalry that was only developed on this show. Another reason you can't just blow this match off with a decisive winner next week, you can't just have 1 week build with this match. Come on. Like I said, I believe Tony Khan, as a booker and promoter, he is a much smarter man than to just blow this match off on free television like that next week. So I am predicting here and now that we are going to get some type of false finish to this match, some type of no contest, double DQ type of finish, which again is very rare in AEW, especially with their big hyped up main events. But I could see a situation and a scenario like that next week. But it leads to the two of them just brawling and just uncontrollable violence between the two of them, to where the only decision that can be made is to lock them inside of a steel cage or let them run wild all throughout the arena in a Falls Count Anywhere match or something like that, where that will be the big main event for All Out, and that will be where we crown one singular undisputed champion. So I'm not ready to get angry and throw pitchforks and all that kind of stuff at this decision quite yet. We'll see how next week plays itself out, but I'm getting a feeling we're not getting a championship unification match next week. At least not one with a decisive outcome. So that's that. But like I mentioned before, the other big thing that happened on this show was the reveal that Kenny Omega is back in AEW. At the end of the show, we got the big main event, the first match in this Trios Championship tournament. It was the team of Andrade El Idolo, Dragon Lee, and Rush taking on the Young Bucks and their mystery partner. When the Bucks came out, they passed a note along to ring announcer Justin Roberts, and he ran down this whole big, special, elaborate entrance like Kenny Omega was getting. He even had the random North Carolina mention in there. And out comes Kenny Omega to a thunderous reaction from the crowd. He is accompanied by Michael Nakazawa and Don Callis, who of course was with Omega in all his matches in his last run last year. Don Callis joined the commentary booth, and he was on the call with Taz, JR, and Excalibur. Throughout the match, Don Callis, he was pointing out the fact that because the other commentators were mentioning how Kenny Omega, he can't possibly be 100% yet. He's not fully cleared. He can't possibly be 100%. And Don Callis was trying to shut all that down. But at the same time, he was also at different points in the match showing great concern and being very concerned about Kenny's well-being, questioning some of the decisions that he was making with some of the big moves that he was attempting. So there's an interesting story that could be told with that alone. But as far as this match here, the match was a lot of fun. You had these 6 guys in there, some fast-paced action with all these guys. Of course, Dragon Lee was one of the big standouts in this match. An insane spot from Dragon Lee towards the end of this match where Rush and Andrade have Omega on the outside. Rush has Omega propped up against the security wall, right? The barrier between the ring and the crowd. He pushes it a little closer to the ring, and he has Omega propped up on it. Andrade's on the apron, holding the top 2 ropes open, and Dragon Lee is in the ring. He's mocking the whole Terminator dive sequence that Omega typically does, and Dragon Lee bounces off the ropes and just slingshots right through the ropes, collides right into Omega, and the two go crashing over the security wall into the crowd. It didn't look like they connected with anyone, didn't look like they hit anyone. Hopefully not. Hopefully no one got hurt. But that was an insane spot. For that spot alone, they need to sign Dragon Lee. But I think we could all figure out why Dragon Lee was in this match, and that became very apparent towards the end of the match. Towards the end of the match, Rush and Andrade are getting fought off by the Bucks. Meanwhile, in the ring, Omega delivers a V-trigger to Dragon Lee and gets him up on his shoulders in a very ugly, uncomfortable way, but still manages to deliver the one-winged angel. I don't know if this was because Omega couldn't really lift him up. He couldn't really get him up over his shoulders. He was kind of teetering, Dragon Lee was, and it looked pretty scary there that he might fall and land on his head or something like that. So luckily that did not happen. Omega managed to hit the move, planted Dragon Lee, and he got the win for his team, himself, and the Bucks. So they advance in this tournament to crown Trios champions, where the finals will take place at All Out. So, like I said, a fun match. Some clear ring rust is still there with Kenny Omega. I think he botched some kind of move earlier in the match, and he did not look completely smooth like the Kenny Omega of old, but this is a guy who is competing in his very first match after being gone for several months with several different injuries at the same time. So you can't expect him to be full on old original cleaner Kenny Omega. We're going to build up to that. I'm just glad Kenny Omega's back. On this show alone, we had Bryan Danielson back in the ring. We had CM Punk back. We had Kenny Omega here. He's back. Who knows how many other people could be coming back in the near future. Adam Cole is one of the last big names on the injury list, and he might be coming back soon. So it's good. This show needs names and big stars like CM Punk, like Bryan Danielson, and like Kenny Omega back on the shows every week. So I'm just happy to see Kenny Omega back. Whether or not he and the Bucks will win those trios titles, some people might call it a little self-serving. I say these trios titles were created in the first place just so Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks would be the first champions. And when you look at the lineup of the other teams in this tournament, I don't see anyone else right now who could realistically beat them for those titles. If the finals come down to them against maybe the House of Black, I could see the House of Black winning. I could see the House of Black being trios champions at some points. I just don't think that point is right now. You could also factor in the idea that Adam Cole might return at the pay-per-view. And the last time we saw Adam Cole and Red Dragon on TV, they were screwing over the Young Bucks. They attacked them. So they could easily be back at the pay-per-view and cost them the titles. That could easily happen. But my prediction as far as the finals, a lot of people would realistically say, oh, it's going to come down to the Bucks and Omega versus the House of Black. I don't think that's going to happen. I think House of Black is going to have their hands tied with Sting, Darby Allin, and Miro on the show. So I think that's going to somehow play a factor in eliminating them from this tournament. And I think we're going to circle back to Hangman and Hangman's connection with the Dark Order. And I think we're going to get the Dark Order versus the Bucks and Kenny Omega at All Out. Not the biggest marquee match you could do, but it fits with the story that's being told, especially with Hangman's involvement. So that's where I see that going. And elsewhere on this show, the other big match hyped up for this show was the big rematch between Bryan Danielson and Daniel Garcia. 2 out of 3 falls. They had Hall of Fame wrestling legend Ricky the Dragon Steamboat on this show. Of course, you know, the whole House of the Dragon thing, so it made sense to have the Dragon on this show. So Ricky Steamboat was out there as the special guest timekeeper. He was a special guest timekeeper for this match as well as the main event. They brought him back out later on. And he had a backstage segment with Chris Jericho and some of the JAS members. He even got a thrust punch on Angelo Parker, so that was good to see Steamboat get physical there. But for this match, he was the timekeeper. Chris Jericho was out there doing guest commentary for this match. And like I said, this match was excellent. I thought even a step above the match that they had on Dynamite a few weeks ago. It got very bloody towards the end, so we filled our quota for the week of blood in a match on an AEW show, because clearly this is something that needs to happen every single week. Whether it's a Jon Moxley match, whether it's any random match, whether it's a blade job, whether it's unintentional, intentional, whatever, there's blood on the show every single week. And when there's blood in a match every single week on TV, it stops meaning anything. So we had blood here. It wasn't a gusher or anything like that, but both men did eventually start bleeding. Garcia picked up the first fall. He made Danielson pass out again in the Dragon Sleeper after he hit him with a pile driver. He locked in the Dragon Sleeper and Bryan passed out. So Garcia got the first fall. Bryan managed to eke out the second fall with a quick roll up, and then the two went on to wrestle and go at it for a few more minutes. At one point, Bryan managed to lock in the triangle sleeper, but Garcia was trying to power himself out of it. Bryan then turned over his hips and he locked in the label lock. Of course, very appropriate now after the recent passing of the man of that name. But this time he locked in the labella lock, and Garcia, now I couldn't tell if he tapped out or he passed out. I think he passed out. Either way, Garcia did not respond to the referee, and he was out. So Danielson picks up the win. He gets his win back in what turned out to be a tremendous match here between the two of them. After the match, Bryan is kind of sitting up against the bottom rope, and Garcia, who is out of it, but he's trying to come to, he's clawing and grasping over at Bryan's leg. Bryan's applauding him. He's giving him a nice golf clap here. Both men eventually get to their feet, and Bryan extends his hand to Garcia to shake his hand. Of course, last week on Rampage, it was Bryan Danielson who got in Daniel Garcia's face and told him, do you want to be the best sports entertainer in the world or the best technical wrestler in the world? So that seed was planted last week, and now we got to see here a sign of respect. Chris Jericho left the commentary booth. He got in the ring and he attacked Bryan Danielson from behind, started pounding on him. But then Daniel Garcia stepped in and he pulled Jericho off of Danielson, and he got in his face. Jericho was getting in Garcia's face. He was pointing his finger in his face, and Garcia swatted Jericho's finger out of his face. So a very tense stare down between the two men. The fans were chanting Garcia's name. They even chanted, "You're a wrestler," which out of context sounds so weird, but it fits the story here of where Daniel Garcia's allegiances lie. After Jericho left, Garcia still stayed in the ring for a little bit. He looked back down at Danielson, but eventually Garcia left as well. So no decision was made here. Although later on in the night, in a backstage promo, Chris Jericho called out Daniel Garcia to meet him on Dynamite face to face to tell him whose side is he on. So very interesting development here with Daniel Garcia. Will he remain a loyal member of the Jericho Appreciation Society, or will he turn his back on them and join the Blackpool Combat Club with all the other wrestlers on this show? Very interesting development there. And I imagine this is going to be setting up a match with Chris Jericho and Daniel Bryan at All Out. Of course, the backstory there with being Jericho took credit for Danielson being injured for all those weeks this summer. So there's that story. And now at the centerpiece is, where does Daniel Garcia's allegiance lie? So I think we could see a blow off to that story come All Out. So good stuff there. As for the rest of the show, outside of these three main things, nothing huge happened. We had a segment with Christian Cage and Jungle Boy, where Jungle Boy challenged Christian to a match at All Out. Christian came out, told him no, and wanted to reconcile. The fans gave these guys the what treatment during their promo, which was unfortunate. That's such an awful chant. One of the worst contributions Stone Cold Steve Austin ever made to the wrestling business was that stupid what chant. But they got the fans back on their side when the two of them started to brawl, and Jungle Boy even got the best of Christian Cage during this brawl. He even stomped on his hand on the steel steps at one point. We had a few other things. Toni Storm won her match, and they announced that it's official. We're getting Toni Storm and Thunder Rosa for the AEW Women's World Championship at All Out. I am in favor of a title change in that match and giving the championship to Toni. We had another big match announcement for All Out. The challenge was laid by Sanjay Dutt, Jay Lethal, and Satnam Singh to Wardlow and FTR, and that challenge was accepted. So we're getting another trios match on that show. And next week on Dynamite, we're going to get Dax Harwood versus Jay Lethal. No doubt will be a really great match, because Dax Harwood, as he mentioned in his promo, he has been one of the best wrestlers of the entire year, tag team and singles. So good stuff there. And nothing else really stood out on this show. There was something with the Acclaimed and the Ass Boys and Billy Gunn. not really going to get in the weeds of all that. I just really wanted to focus on the main 3 big events of this show involving Kenny Omega's return, the Danielson Garcia rematch, and of course the main centerpiece being the CM Punk Jon Moxley development. So that's about it for me. I thought overall this was a really good show, and I do think we are still going to get Punk and Moxley at the pay-per-view. It just might have a stipulation attached to it that might be set up next week. So I do not expect a clean outcome of the match next week. I think whatever they're going to do next week is just going to further build to the all-out pay-per-view. But again, that remains to be seen. But that is it for me. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, if you liked what you saw, go ahead, leave a like, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts were on this show and where you see things going as we get closer to the all-out pay-per-view. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter at DerekJ Speaks, listen to me on SoundCloud, all the good platforms, and I will be back here very soon covering more AEW shows, more WWE shows, and whatever else I feel like talking about. So again, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.